I pushed you away because the depth of your perfection frightened me. It wasn't about you. It was about my fear of handling something so flawless and how it challenged my own sense of adequacy. In retrospect, I realized that the very reason I distanced myself from you was because you were everything I had ever dreamed of. The fear of such a perfect match made me act irrationally. I now understand that my fear of how perfectly you fit into my life was the root of my actions. I pushed you away, not out of lack of love, but out of fear that I wasn't ready for someone so right. Your perfection was so profound that it made me question my own ability to maintain such a connection. I pushed you away because I was scared of the happiness that seemed too perfect. I realize now that pushing you away was a defense mechanism against the overwhelming realization of how perfect you were for me. The thought of someone so right made me retreat. The perfection you brought into my life was so intense that it scared me. I pushed you away because I couldn't handle the idea of having everything I ever wanted. Looking back, it's clear that my fear of how well you matched my life made me push you away. I was overwhelmed by the thought of a connection that seemed too perfect to be real. The more perfect you seemed, the more I backed away. My fear of not being able to live up to such a flawless match led me to make decisions that I now deeply regret. Pushing you away was my way of coping with the fear of your perfection. I was scared of how right you felt in my life and the vulnerability that came with accepting someone so perfectly suited for me. I pushed you away because I was afraid of how seamlessly you fit into my life. Your perfection made me question my own worthiness and led me to create distance where there should have been closeness. The fear of having someone so perfect for me led me to act out in ways I now regret. I pushed you away, not because I didn't care, but because I was terrified of accepting something so flawless. Your presence in my life was so perfectly aligned with my desires that it made me retreat. I was scared of how right you were for me and the vulnerability that came with such a deep connection. I now see that my fear of how perfectly you fit into my life drove me to push you away. The thought of someone so ideal made me question my readiness and ability to handle such a profound relationship. The more I realized how perfect you were for me, the more I distanced myself. It wasn't about you. It was about my own fears and insecurities, about accepting such a perfect match. Pushing you away was my way of dealing with the overwhelming realization of how perfect you were for me. I was scared of what such a flawless connection meant for my own sense of self. You were everything I had ever hoped for, and that's why I acted out. The perfection of our match made me question my readiness to embrace a connection that felt too right. I pushed you away because I was afraid of how perfectly you fit into my life. The fear of not being able to live up to such an ideal made me create distance rather than face the reality of our connection. The realization of how perfect you were for me was too overwhelming. I pushed you away because the thought of having someone so right in my life made me retreat out of fear. I acted out of fear when I pushed you away. Your perfection exposed my insecurities and made me question my own ability to handle such a deep and flawless connection. You were a perfect match, and that's what scared me. The fear of facing such a profound connection led me to push you away rather than embrace the happiness that was within reach. Looking back, I see that my fear of your perfection made me act irrationally. I pushed you away because I couldn't handle the thought of someone being so perfectly suited for me. The more perfect you seemed, the more I retreated. My fear of being with someone so right made me question my own worthiness and led me to create distance where there should have been closeness. I realize now that pushing you away was my way of protecting myself from the vulnerability of accepting someone who was perfectly matched with my heart. I was scared of such a deep connection. Your perfection was so intense that it made me step back. I pushed you away because the thought of having someone so ideal in my life was too overwhelming for me to handle. I pushed you away not because of you, but because of my fear of how perfectly you fit into my life. The realization of such a perfect match made me question my own readiness and worthiness. The fear of accepting someone so perfectly aligned with my life led me to act in ways that pushed you away. I now see that my actions were driven by a fear of handling such a profound connection. I realize now that I pushed you away not because I didn't care, but because I was overwhelmed by how perfectly you fit into my life. It terrified me to think that someone so right could come along and shake my world. In my heart, I knew you were everything I ever wanted, but fear made me act out in ways I now regret. The thought of being so perfectly matched with someone made me retreat, afraid to embrace the happiness that seemed too good to be true. You were everything I had been waiting for, and that's exactly why I pushed you away. The fear of losing something so perfect made me doubt, and in my doubt, I lost the chance to hold on to what was meant to be. I look back now and see how my fears of your perfection drove me to make mistakes. It's hard to admit that the very qualities that made you right for me were the ones that scared me into pushing you away. You were a reflection of everything I had hoped for, and that's why I struggled to accept it. I was scared of how perfect you were, because it meant I had to face my own insecurities and flaws. The more I realized how perfect you were for me, the more I pushed you away. It was my way of protecting myself from the vulnerability that comes with loving someone who seems to fit every part of your heart. My fear of being with someone so perfectly suited for me made me question everything. I acted out and created distance because I couldn't handle the thought of having everything I ever wanted. Pushing you away was never about not loving you. It was about my fear of how seamlessly you fit into my life and how that perfection made me question my readiness for such a profound connection. I was overwhelmed by how perfectly you matched my dreams and desires. That perfection was so intense, it made me step back, unable to accept that someone so right could truly be mine. Looking back, I see that I pushed you away because your presence exposed my deepest fears. You were perfect, and that perfection made me confront insecurities I wasn't ready to face. The very reason I distanced myself from you was the same reason I should have embraced you. Your perfection made me afraid of not being enough, and that fear led me to make the mistake of pushing you away. You were everything I had hoped for, and that's why I struggled to accept you. The thought of someone being so perfect for me was daunting, and I retreated in fear rather than embracing what was right. My fear of how perfect you were for me led me to push you away. I couldn't handle the realization that someone so aligned with my heart could come into my life and make me confront my deepest fears. I pushed you away because I was afraid of how effortlessly you seemed to fit into my life. The fear of such perfection made me act irrationally, and now I regret not recognizing the gift you truly were. You were a perfect match, and that's what scared me. The idea of having someone who seemed to complete me was too overwhelming, and in my fear, I created distance where there should have been closeness. The perfection I saw in you made me question my own worthiness. It wasn't that I didn't care. I was afraid of not being able to live up to the ideal that you represented in my life. My fear of your perfection made me act out of character. I pushed you away because I was scared of how complete and right you felt in my life, not realizing that I was only hurting myself in the process. You were the embodiment of everything I desired, and that scared me. I pushed you away because I wasn't prepared to face the reality of having someone so perfect for me. The more I realized how perfectly you fit into my life, the more I withdrew. Your perfection made me question my readiness and worthiness, leading me to push away something that felt so right. Pushing you away was my way of protecting myself from the vulnerability of accepting someone who was perfectly suited for me. I was afraid of what such a perfect match would mean for my own sense of security. I see now that my fear of how perfectly you fit into my life made me act in ways that I regret. The perfection you represented was so overwhelming that I pushed you away rather than face the fear of such a deep connection. You were everything I ever wanted, and that scared me. I pushed you away because the perfection of our match made me question my own readiness and ability to handle such a profound relationship. I now understand that my fear of how perfectly you matched my life made me act out in ways that pushed you away. It wasn't a lack of love, but a fear of facing the reality of having everything I ever desired. The perfection you brought into my life was too much for me to handle. I pushed you away because I was scared of facing the depth of what it meant to be with someone who fit so perfectly into my world.